We are one day away from being able to welcome in the month of March, and as such, it's time for new entry in the X months into 2018 series that I apparently started doing. Um, I wish I had an intro because that would have been the perfect place to put one. Anyways, what I want to talk about today is whether it's worth buying a Steam controller in 2018, bearing in mind that it was released in November of 2015. So obviously its age is a part of that consideration, and the fact that there are newer options to choose from. I do want to point out this video is more of a review or something that's more opinion oriented than something that is going to be based on technical analysis. So it's something, if you go in on the Steam page for the Steam controller and you scroll down and you look at the reviews that are posted, this video is going to be basically of that nature, more so than a video on YouTube where they, give you the whole rundown. Plenty of those already exist if you're interested in that. Just my caution, make sure you watch one where they did more than open up the box, use it for 5 minutes, and tell you why they think it sucks, right? At least watch a video where the person used it for like a couple days or something, and that way they actually know what they're talking about. So two things I just want to mention really quickly before I forget. I'm making this video with respect to PC gaming because we're talking about a Steam controller. This should be readily apparent, but in case it's not, I'll make the point. I'm talking about which is the Steam controller a good option for PC gaming because it's a Steam controller. So that's, anyways, like I say, should be readily apparent. I also just want to note the controllers I've used. So I've used the Xbox One controller, the newer updated version that has a 3.5 jack that can connect to Bluetooth, that one. Generally it's good. I mean, I like it. It feels good. Feels a lot nicer than the Xbox 360 controller, which felt nice to begin with. The D-pad's a lot nicer on that than on the 360 controller, to be sure, and I'm going to come back to that point. I have not used a PS4 controller. Although the one thing I will say is I like the fact that the D-pad is actual for buttons, and I'm going to come back to that as well. I have used the grip controller from the Nintendo Switch, which is just you take the Joy-Cons that come with the Switch, and then there's a grip accessory that you slide them into, and it makes it like a traditional controller. I really like that. It's probably very simple, but I really do like that. And again, I like the fact that the D-pad is 4 actual buttons. And again, I will be coming back to that. I have not used the Pro controller for the Switch, but I imagine it's really similar to the grip anyways. So I just wanted to note those two things. Also, because the Steam controller is a lot older, it lacks two notable features that most newer controllers are going to have. So it doesn't have a 3.5 jack, so that's just your audio jack to plug in earphones. It doesn't have it. And you cannot sync it to your computer via Bluetooth. Now, to me, these aren't major issues, but they are worth noting because they are minor, but they are inconveniences. And that just goes along with getting an older controller. If you get an older Xbox One controller, guess what? Same deal, it's just because it's older. Now, the thing I want to talk about as well is the size, the layout, the buttons of the Steam controller, that kind of thing. And this is probably the most important consideration relative to whether it's still worth buying a Steam controller. And I'm going to qualify that statement in a second. But it has obviously a unique layout. And I can't really say anything whether it's better or worse than like a PS4 controller, having not used it. I think in that respect it would be more personal preference anyway, but like relative to like a Xbox One controller, which is sort of for most people the go-to controller for PC gaming, it's not really better or worse. That is, it's not really easier or harder to use, at least for me. And so like, for example, the face buttons are directly right of the left joystick, also the only joystick. And that difference in layout, is just as easy. It's not easier. It's only just as easy. To me, like there's no difficulty change in using it. The size is nice. I know some people have complained, not a lot of people, but some people complained it's too big. I don't know who it's too big for. Maybe small children would probably have an issue with it, but I mean, I have really small girly hands, okay? And for me, it's like literally the perfect size. It fits like, well, like I say, perfectly. I will note this, if you had to hold down the right trigger, the right back button, and the right A button for any period of time greater than 10 seconds for some strange reason, that would get uncomfortable really fast because of it is bigger. But like you could easily just press all of those at the same time. The size to me is basically perfect. The one thing I will say is on the grips on the side, it kind of comes up very like straight, so it can be a little awkward getting your fingers up there to the trigger and bumper. I will say this though, and this is a point for the Steam controller. On the Xbox One controller, the triggers on the back, they angle up in a really obnoxious way, so it's hard to get your first finger on the bumper and your second finger on the trigger, because you're basically, unless you want to squish your fingers together, you want to put your second finger on the end of the trigger, and just because of how sharply it angles, there's not a lot for it to sit on. It's really awful. But on the Steam controller, you can put your first and second finger on the bumper and trigger, and it feels really comfortable. So that's definitely a point for the Steam controller. So I said I was going to come back to the D-pad. I hate the D-pad on the Steam controller. I'm just going to say it. It's just too easy for me to misclick. It's definitely better than the D-pad on the 360 controller, and probably at least as good as the one on the, well, I'll say almost as good as the one on the Xbox controller, just to me, and it's probably just because I'm misclicking, just because it's like just a circle with a D-pad ingress in it. But for me, it's really easy to misclick and be unprecise, and I almost find the analog stick a little bit more precise, which to me the D-pad is really there, or it should be there when you for when you have to be very precise, like in menus and stuff, and you don't want to accidentally give a right input when you're only trying to scroll down to the menu. That's what the D-pad is for. So that's probably the biggest issue I'd raise with it. I really do prefer D-pads like on the grip controller and then the PS4 controller where it's just 4 buttons. That to me works a lot better. One thing to consider, and this is a point against the controller, but it's a point for Valve. So what I mean is the greatest thing about the controller isn't even the controller. It's the software behind the controller that allows you to create those custom configurations. So the reason this is a point against the controller but for Valve is the same reason we're not going to spend any time talking about that software, in relation to whether you should buy a Steam controller. And the reason is this: you don't need to use a Steam controller to make use of that software. Okay, so originally you did, but more recently Valve released patches that allow you to use basically any controller you want, including a Pro from the Nintendo Switch if you want it, and you can use any of them. I think the PS4 became supported in 2016, and I think like Xbox One and just any generic controller became supported in 2017. So you can use any controller with the software. And what that means is before, if you wanted to take advantage of the software, you had to use the Steam controller. And so that means if you wanted to make your own custom configurations or use community configurations, you didn't have that choice. So any game that didn't offer native controller support, your only choices were the Steam controller or a mouse and keyboard. But now the playing field is wide open, and all any of these controllers have to stand on is their merits. Okay, so for all of that, is it worth buying a Steam controller when you do not have to buy a Steam controller to use the software? Because the software is the real star of the show. The software is amazing. And that's what allows you to tweak out your controller, to customize it, to make it work really well with any game. But you don't need to use a Steam controller, so is it still worth buying? The trackpads allow for even more customization, like unparalleled customization relative to a joystick. It just, you can set it to work as a mouse if you want. You can set it to work as a joystick. There's just so many more options with that, in my opinion, at least. And it really, if you go into the customization software, the controller configuration software, and you see how much more you can do with the trackpad relative to a joystick, it's amazing. And the back buttons are a nice touch as well, and those are probably the two main merits of the Steam controller. And you get those for a lot cheaper than an Xbox One Elite controller would cost. And the only real advantage the Xbox One Elite controller has over the Steam controller is the fact that it has 4 back buttons. And to me, people are going to talk about the magnetized parts and whatever. I don't care about that. The PS4 controller has a touchpad that allows you to create unique bindings, which would obviously be useful for like MMORPG games. But the software allows you to create touch menus, so that kind of, in my opinion, removes that advantage, because you can compensate with the touch menus on any other controller you want to use. So the Steam controller, it's an odd duck, because it's meant for people who want to use a mouse and keyboard to use if they need to use a controller instead. So part of this as well is, does it beat out a mouse and keyboard? And I think if you're used to a mouse and keyboard, well, no. Because you're used to a mouse and keyboard and you're probably fine with that and you don't even want a controller. So my general verdict, should you buy it? It depends. Depends on your situation. If you already have controllers, I say don't bother. The configuration software is going to make them work well enough. If you wanted to buy controllers and you didn't already have any, if you were used to mouse and keyboard, and let's say you just want something for, if you have friends over to play, a couch co-op game, then I would go with the Steam controllers. It's going to be an easier transition. The trackpad is going to be a lot more similar to using a mouse than an analog stick is. It's going to be easier to be precise with that relative to an analog stick. So I would go with the Steam controllers in that case. If you wanted something similar to the Xbox Elite controller, I would just buy a Steam controller instead. It's not worse, but it's cheaper. So to me, that makes it a better option. You don't have as many buttons on the back, granted, but the trackpad is a little nicer than an analog stick, so it makes up for it in that way. If you just want new controllers and you're used to using controllers with analog sticks, and just for some reason maybe, I don't know, they've crapped out and you need new ones, I would say maybe. The Steam controller is probably marginally better than other controllers, despite lacking a few conveniences, but it would take you, you would have to get used to it, so I think it would depend on whether you wanted to stick with what you already know how to use or if you want to try something new. I'll just conclude by saying this: the concept of the Steam controller is undeniably great. And if Valve put out an improved version, I know I would recommend that in a heartbeat. But as for this controller, this wonderful oddity, I think whether you should buy it in 2018 really depends on your situation. Anyways, that's all for the video. So, if you watched it and you enjoyed it, give it a like. And, I hope it gave you something to think about the Steam controller. And beyond that, just enjoy the rest of your day. Bye.